Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to open the 10th GMO-free Europe conference. My name is Benny Herrlin. I have been organizing these conferences since 2005, and I also had the pleasure to be a member of this parliament when the first GMO legislation was discussed in the period between 84 and 89. It was adopted then later in 99, and we have a situation today that we will discuss that is really questioning the entire philosophy, the entire concept of the precautionary approach of the European Union on genetic engineering in food and agriculture. This is the theme today, and I am very happy to hand over the word at this moment to Sarah Wiener, who is our host, and most of you will know her actually. She is not only a star cook and a famous farmer, she is also a member of the European Parliament on behalf of the Austrian Greens. Sarah.
Thank you for these nice words. I'm also a beekeeper, by the way. Can I speak in German?
Yeah.
Oh, this is nice. So I will speak in Austrian.
The Austrian minister
if the
has to
interpreters
comment
allow.
Because we are in the European Parliament, so we honor also here the biodiversity of languages. Deswegen
And that's why I would now like to switch to my mother tongue, Austrian, and warmly welcome you all. Thank you for making it here. Thank you for picking up on this important topic. Thank you to Leonora Gewesler, the Austrian minister who's made the journey here, presumably because she thinks it's so important. Thanks to Benny Hell and Save Our Seeds and the other participants, whether they be in front of a computer or here in quite a full room, actually, to address this important topic, a topic that will affect all of our futures, something that we need to look at more closely. I'll give an introduction. I want to keep it brief because this afternoon there's a long program you have before you with many experts, a number of panels. Maybe I can just mention why we want to organize this conference and why new genomic techniques, well, genetically modified microorganisms or organisms, why this is a topic, why do we see it as an issue that needs addressing? Because it's not a question of whether we need to look at this as an ideological question, as new genomic techniques, are they the savior of humanity or not? No. What I would like to look at is mention a number of points and why this legislation coming our way will prove to be problematic and whether it's useful or not. At the press conference, I mentioned a few points. I'm happy to pick up on those ideas. I'm sure you are as well, so that we can look at that in a different framework as well. Maybe I can just mention that once this legislation comes our way, there's an important principle that would have been undermined, and that is the whole overriding concern of the precautionary principle in Europe. We really have to understand what it means to dismiss so casually this precautionary principle, a precautionary principle that we've fought for a long time and that has made us world leaders, that has given us a degree of safety and security, and what we can count on now if we want to give up on the precautionary principle for this form of technology, which is questionable. There are a few other points that need addressing as well. Transparency of genetic technologies, which is missing because there's no obligatory labeling, and how genetic technologies will be labeled and signaled. Another question is contamination. Drift, if it be conventional crops that don't want genetically modified crops on their land, or organic agriculture that wouldn't be able to protect itself against these GMOs or genetic techniques because they don't know even if their neighbour's using these technologies or not. There's a problem of the long-term aspect of this. It hasn't been looked into. How can we row back on this if we don't even know what has been defined as what is being there in the first place? You know that we're having this discussion. We cannot prove or demonstrate genetic technologies because if you could, there'd be problems with patents. And this runs back to the 80s. Certain genetic sequences have been patented, and this is another massive problem. The problem of a monopolization of patenting and the uniformity of our seeds, of our world heritage that is it belongs to all of us when it comes to species, when it comes to races, when it comes to seeds. Over the last 50 years alone, 90% of our diversity has been lost in seeds. Now, if you look at the old genetic technologies, what sort of restrictions and limitations there were, and what sort of reduction and senseless loss in characteristics and species in certain types of mountain rye that still grows at 1,000 meters above sea level in Austria, that we've lost that. And given the multi-crises we're facing, biodiversity and environment, we are giving up on our biodiversity in a voluntary fashion to allow these companies to decide over seeds and dominate. A further problem is the resistance of pesticides, resistance to pesticides. We are saying that seeds would be treated and therefore wouldn't have to use as much pesticides, but the opposite is proven to be true. We've seen that since 2017, it hasn't gone up 30%. Oh, it's gone up 300%, threefold in Brazil, the use of pesticides through monopolization and the patenting. This means that prices for farmers are going up, and obviously indirectly that means that we who eat products have to foot that bill as well, and also it's a question of what we end up being able to choose or not choose ending up on our plate. So there are many points that we need and would like to talk about. Maybe you can just pick out a few that I see as particularly important. I'm sure there are nuances and other aspects that other experts and guests would like to pick up on. So I hope we have a very good conference, and I hope we reach a consensus that maybe in terms of society, this is still something that needs discussing, and that we can have a good, robust, democratic solution that will serve everyone, and so that those who want to can eat in such a way as they please, and that if they can do that without GM in the future, that must be possible. I'm looking forward to all of you taking the floor and contributing, and I hope you stay for the next few hours. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Zara. Leonora Gewessler, if I can put it this way, you are the leader of those voices who are critical vis-à-vis genetic technologies in the Council of Ministers. It's a great honour to welcome you here today. And in this first block, of course, we're looking at the national level, and then at the regional level, and then at the municipal level, and then the other levels that are represented here. And I'm very pleased to be able to give you the floor now on this very important topic.
Herzlichen Dank. Auch ich.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll continue in German then. Thank you very much for this very friendly welcome. Thank you for those kind words. I'd like to turn it around and say it's an honor for me to be here and be able to kick off with a national view here in the European Parliament. I don't think that's always self-evident, so thank you for that. This conference here, looking at what Benny Herlin's done, I have a great deal of respect. I've followed this for 20 years. The idea of maintaining the possibility to have a GMO-free Europe That's something I want to see in future. I spoke with Martin Häusling a bit. You get frustrated and you look at the discussions we had 20 years ago, and these are having to be rehashed again and again. You realize that securing that GMO-free agriculture is something which now, at this very point in time, is being endangered because of the dangerous developments in the EU. The proposal from the European Commission, if it were to be implemented per se, would lead to wide-ranging deregulation of GMOs using new genomic techniques. And in Austria, my colleagues and I have always said we're not just going to exclude out of hand new technologies, but the use of new technologies, especially in agriculture, because it's in the biosphere, is linked to potential risks. And when it comes to new technologies, recent technologies such as new genomic techniques, NGTs, it's clear that maintaining the precautionary principle is absolutely essential. Saravina has already put that up as a kind of red thread. And I think that's something that we cannot dismiss easily. The idea of protection from this legislation to have and maintain a high level of environmental standards for production and in the environment, that's something that needs to be looked at very closely. Look at the limited risk assessments. I think they would have to say that you can't use NGTs. Now, as Saravina said, it's a question of the producers having the freedom of choice and also for consumers having the freedom of choice. These are central issues as far as we're concerned. And when it comes to the implementation of this proposal, it will lead to a severe restriction of that freedom. We can only have that freedom if you have extensive labeling from the seed to the supermarket shelves. That's the only way we can guarantee this freedom, to ensure that I, as a consumer, as a farmer, have that free choice. And what's closely linked to the free choice of consumers, and here for Austria it's a very important issue, is the maintenance of biodiversity and GMO-free food production. Again, that can only continue to exist if it is impossible in the future as well to seal off parts of the land of territory from GMO plantings. Now, the Commission's proposal doesn't include any sort of proposal along these lines there, and we need to have coexistence measures in place that would be applicable across Europe. Of course, conventional producers and GMO-free producers need to know what's going on to be able to have coexistence measures in place, and I think the coexistence measures that are coming down the road are actually leading to a distortion of competition and will actually worsen the situation. As far as we're concerned, the Commission's proposal, and I need to say this in no uncertain terms, 3 points that I think are important. The proposal of the Commission in its current form is not acceptable. When it comes to the security of consumers and the environment, maintaining the environment and these GMOs, these are 3 points, if you like, that are not or only insufficiently being served by this legislation. As far as we're concerned, this is a red line. This is not acceptable. Through the extensive exemption possibilities from risk assessment, the criteria that have been drawn up, which are solely technological ones rather than the characteristics and interaction of plants in the environment, leads to this contradiction with the precautionary principle. The restriction of obligations for labelling, that will not allow freedom of choice, will not allow the maintenance of GMO-free agriculture, where there's a shift of burden and responsibility as well. It's not just removing the burden for labelling, but it's also the burden for traceability. So coexistence will suffer because of that. If you don't have the right guidelines, if you don't have the rules that will apply Europe-wide, then that's not going to work, because there'll be different conditions that will be used within the EU for the same production. The ban that's set out on member states that is currently in place because of the legislation on part of territories that can be removed from GMO production, I think a severe restriction removing that ability, I think, is something that could even lead to the destruction and disappearance of various productions and territories. We have had negotiations for years, even decades, and with this new measure, it's simply being switched off. And so to conclude, I would say that I, myself, and all my colleagues are doing our utmost and will continue to do our utmost to make sure that in Council we have a position adopted that will change this proposed legislation to get rid of the concerns we have. As far as I'm concerned, this is absolutely necessary. It's absolutely necessary to ensure that we continue to have a possibility to have GMO-free areas. We shouldn't forget the challenges of today's world. Of course, there are successes that we can also notch up for GMO-free areas. So I'm going to be fighting in the Council for that, and I think everybody represented here in this room will fight at their level as well. Thank you.
We stay in the German language, and we welcome Anka Dobslav on the screen, who will join us from Lower Saxony, where she is the State Secretary of the Ministry for Environment. And Lower Saxony is one of actually 64 GMO-free regional governments within the European Union, and I'm very much looking forward to hear from Lower Saxony. Are you there, Anka? No? She's coming. Okay. Hello. Welcome. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Welcome.
Okay.
Hello.
So sorry for the technical problems. Good afternoon, everyone. Even if my mother tongue is German too, I'd like to give my speech in English as it is prepared here. So thanks for the invitation to today's event, and a warm welcome to all honored panelists and guests. A special thanks to you, Benny Hurlin, for organizing the conference. And I would like to welcome also Mrs. Gwessler, dear Leonore. It's a pleasure to speak together with you at a conference so many years after we met first in Brussels. And I'm really sorry that I can't be in Brussels today. So also warm welcome to Mrs. Sarah Wiener, Mr. Martin Häusling, Mr. Christoph Clergot, and Tilly Metz. Thanks also to you for organizing and discussing these important issues today. I'm glad for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the regional governments. At first, I'd like to send best wishes from our Minister Christian Mayer. For both of us, Minister Mayer and me, GMO is a topic we worked already on in our previous positions. So Christian Mayer, he was a Minister for Agriculture in Lower Saxony 10 years ago, and now is Minister for Environment. And I myself worked on agriculture and consumer protection issues for about 10 years before I was appointed as State Secretary for Environment, Climate Protection and Energy Policy last year, November. For Lower Saxony, as a main agricultural region in Germany, being a member of the network is from special importance. So the reason I could not travel to you are a couple of important meetings in Berlin and in Lower Saxony this week. I hope next time I can meet you all in person. Today, the 10th GMO-free Europe conference is a good moment to look back. In 2013, Lower Saxony, as one of the 16 regions in Germany, joined the network of GMO-free regions. And by joining the network, we committed to the goals of the Florence Charter and thus to the protection of a GMO-free agriculture. Just to recall these principles, the main demands and objectives of the Charter are protection of seeds intended for the GMO-free agriculture from contamination by genetically modified organisms, and the demand that European regions themselves should have the ability to define their areas or part of them as GMO-free. That's especially important for us as a regional government. Lower Saxony pursues a strategy of zero tolerance in order to achieve the goals of the Charter, and the use of genetic engineered is not permitted on land owned by the state of Lower Saxony. And our state owns quite a lot of agricultural land. In Germany, apart from Lower Saxony, the federal states of Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, Bremen, Brandenburg, Hamburg, Hesse, Mecklenburg, Western Pomerania, North Rhine-Westphalia, Rhineland-Palatinate, Saarland, Schleswig-Holstein, and Thuringia have joined so far. We hope the remaining will join soon. Meanwhile, more than 30,000 farmers in Germany are committed to working GMO-free. More than 1 million hectares of agricultural land in Germany are now part of a GMO-free region or initiative. In addition, more than 300 municipalities are committed to GMO-free farming and prohibit the cultivation of GMOs on their leased land. Considering all these ambitions, the European Commission's recent proposal for a regulation on plants obtained by certain new genomic techniques and their food and feed is not acceptable in our view. Let me explain the reasons. According to the proposal of the European Commission, plants produced with the help of NGT will be divided into two categories. In particular, for those plants that meet the criteria for equivalence with conventional plants, there is now to be extensive deregulation. For as soon as a plant is classified as a Category 1 NGT plant, GMO legislation is not to apply. These plants are to be regarded as conventionally bred plants. Cultivation can thus take place without restriction. Category 1 NGT plants are not to go through an approval procedure in which a risk assessment and an environmental impact assessment must be submitted. The risks to the environment and health are those disregarded and undesirable effects are not investigated. It is planned that only labeling the seeds is compulsory. All NGT plants and Category 2 NGT products that have more complex genome modifications shall continue to be subject to the requirements of the EU GMO legislation unless they are accepted by the regulation. They shall also continue to be subject to the traceability and labeling requirements in the EU GMO regulatory framework. It goes without saying that plants obtained using two new genomic techniques are genetically modified plants. Therefore, for organic production, which is a huge production also here in Lower Saxony, no use of GNT plants of either category or their product is allowed. But coexistence measures to prevent the mixing of varieties of NGT plants with conventional or organic varieties have to be taken by the member states. As one of 16 regions in Germany and many more in the whole European Union, we are always searching for our scope of action. Now, here's one, but strictly limited. Member states of the European Union have the possibility to restrict or prohibit the cultivation of GMOs in their territory. That does not apply to NGT plants, so there exists no possibility for an opt-out and thus no free choice for the member states. The will of consumers is thus not taken seriously by the new regulation. In the sixth German Nature Awareness Survey conducted at the end of 2019, 81% of the 2,000 respondents voted for a ban on genetic engineering in agriculture, and the majority of consumers in Germany are against lowering of genetic engineering standards. The surveys clearly show the majority of consumers do not want genetic engineering in their food, on the fields, or in the stables. The majority of them want strict criteria for the safety and risk assessment of genetically modified plants and clear labeling. I can assure you we will continue to strive for a GMO-free Europe here in Lower Saxony. In our coalition agreement, the government of Lower Saxony and the leading parties of this coalition, the Social Democrats and the Greens, clearly commit to keeping Lower Saxony GMO-free in the future. In order to continue to guarantee GMO-free agriculture in Lower Saxony, our demands are the following. The current genetic engineering law in Europe must be maintained, and with it the risk and environmental impact assessment. Traceability is also impossible without regulation. In order to ensure the freedom of choice for consumers, the implementation of the currently applicable labelling obligations is demanded. In order not to endanger GMO-free conventional and organic agriculture, we continue to call for strict regulation and coexistence rules to protect GMO-free agriculture. As a state government, we are still convinced that genetic engineering has not and will not contribute to solutions against biodiversity loss and the climate crisis. We are very glad to know that Austria is fighting side by side with us, and also that the participants of this event share common objectives. So I'm eager to listen to your discussions and further remarks and speeches. Please excuse me that I need to leave the conference at 4 p.m. due to other important meetings. Thank you for your attention and your common effort towards a GMO-free Europe. I wish you all an interesting and successful conference. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Anka Dobslav. We stay in Germany. We go to Bavaria, actually. And Mr. Georg Scheitz is the mayor of the municipality of Andex, famous for its monastery and also for its wonderful beer. And he is also the vice commissioner of the Starnberg County, which has declared itself GMO-free at an early stage and has just reiterated this decision. And I'm very proud and happy to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us, Georg Scheitz. And please do speak in German, of course.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. For some years already, I have been engaged in the issue of GMO-free farming and our GMO-free region. I represent the district of Starnberg, and for 3 years I have been the mayor of Andex. And in 2009, Andex, together with the authorities, took up a very definite position against GMO methods of farming. And we have pursued that since. We've had pressure from the people and from farmers who have told us that this is the way they want to do it. And very early in the day, we took a decision in our region. And the decision of 2009 thus excluded the current GMO technical procedures and adjusted it towards the European regulations. It was pretty clear in those days, and this is the line we want to take continuously. We want to remain GMO-free as a region, and we want to ensure that this applies in other bodies. The interpreter apologizes, but for technical reasons, we have to stop interpreting.
Schaffen Sie eine europäische Rahmenrichtlinie, die die Regionen einfach sichert in ihrer traditionellen Landwirtschaft und die genauso Fortschritt vorlässt, aber keine Gentechnik zulässt. Und somit ist mir das um die Zukunft unserer Landwirte ganz wichtig und so sehe ich auch die Zukunft gesichert. Ich weiß, von was ich rede. Ich selber habe 30 Jahre einen landwirtschaftlichen Betrieb geführt und mir ist es wirklich ein Anliegen, wir können das, wir können mit normalen Mitteln haben wir erfolgreich Landwirtschaft gemacht. Und ich bin der Meinung, das funktioniert weiterhin. Wir brauchen keinen Gentechnikanbau. Wir müssen uns abheben von der Welt. Und ich hoffe, dass viele so denken wie wir. Und das trägt einfach zum Schutz der landwirtschaftlichen Familienbetriebe bei. Und ich denke auch für die regionale Wirtschaftskraft und die Produktion vor Ort hat es vieles auszusagen. Und deshalb schützen Sie, machen Sie alles möglich, damit wir hier verschont bleiben auf viele Jahre, damit auch die nächste Generation wieder Landwirtschaft betreiben kann und vor allen Dingen die nächste Generation eine gesicherte Bauernfamilie wieder darstellt. Ja, wie kam es zu dem Beschluss? Es war fast ein einstimmiger Beschluss 2009 und war zur jetzigen Phase auch ein fast einstimmiger Beschluss. Und ich möchte nochmal sagen, er war komplett mit den Vertretern der Landwirte abgesprochen. Und von dem her sieht man, wo die Reise hingeht. Die Landwirtschaft braucht das nicht. Ich denke, sie will das auch zum Großteil nicht. Und so hoffe ich einfach, dass Sie uns zustimmen, dass Sie uns unterstützen werden und somit den Landkreis Starnberg natürlich auch in einer guten Erinnerung haben in Ihrem Kreis. Und ich möchte nur nochmal den Appell richten, passen Sie hier auf, machen Sie alles möglich. Wir möchten Landwirtschaft betreiben und wir sind nicht mit Sicherheit kein altgebackener Landkreis. Wir haben viel Ackerbaubetriebe, wir haben große Ackerbaubetriebe. Wir waren sehr modern aufgestellt bei den ersten Ackerbaubetrieben. Wir haben Schweinehaltung, Rinderhaltung, Milcherzeugung. Wir sind sehr unterschiedliche Regionen, auch von den Höhenlagen der Bonitäten. Und ich möchte nur noch mal bestätigen, bitte passen Sie darauf auf, werden Sie Ihren Aufgaben dahingehend, unterstützen Sie uns. Danke.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scheitz, and I hope this resonates also a little bit with the European EPP and Mr. Weber, who is in the same party as Mr. Scheitz. It is not all a question of ideologies. It is also a question of common understanding amongst farmers, amongst consumers in the municipalities at the regional level. I think the discussions about GMOs are quite different when you look at the municipal level, when you look at the discussions in the villages, when farmers, be they organic or be they conventionally working, discuss this issue, then when we hear the speeches here in the Agricultural Committee and in the Environment Committee. And I thank you all also very much for keeping the time, because this allows us to really broaden the discussion now. We have representatives from many regions, from many countries, from many NGOs, from many other grassroots organizations here in the room. And we've been discussing this issue already yesterday in a more closed situation. I think for many of us, this is the beginning of a battle, I have to say. that will be fought over the next months, actually. And I'd be happy to give the floor to whomever dares to be the first to speak from the floor. Don't leave me alone, please. Yes, please. Just tell us your name and where you come from. And yes.
I'm Grietje Rapers from Nordic Maize Breeding from the Netherlands. And I'm a mostly organic maize seed producer. And I wonder for the category 1 entities, why is there not a marker added to the CRISPR, the CRISPRed genes? Because that would allow, in case of contamination, to find out where the contaminations come from, and also, well, might enable to shift the cost to the polluter and not for the contaminated one.
An interesting question. We've all been posing this question. And in the next panel, we will have a couple of scientists who will probably also dwell on this a little further. My unscientific answer is because there is no intention to do so. It could well be done, of course, but I understand that the intention of this deregulation is to let the GM technology slip into the wilderness without traceability, actually. But Mute Schimpf, you have an answer as well, I guess.
No, I have another question.
Just go ahead, anyway.
Normally, I always speak English here, but today I have 2 questions in German. Eine Frage.
A question to Minister Gewessler. Should the Commission proposal go through as it currently is? Is there any possibility that people might challenge it, that there might be some complaints about it in connection to environmental protection? And I've also got a question to Mr. Scheitz. If I understood correctly, we are suggesting that other regions should adopt the same type of agriculture as you have. Is it just Bavaria that you're talking about, or are you thinking about beyond areas in Bavaria?
With answering now in English for a change, so we keep the biodiversity, as Sarah Wiener said, also in the language of this conference. First, we'll go to the fight, and first we'll go to the battle, as Benny Herlin also said it, and there is some work to do. And yes, there was a push now from the Spanish presidency to finalize this rather quickly, but the next days and weeks are crucial, and months are crucial, and that's what we focus on at the moment. I know Austria has a reputation for also going the extra mile. As some of you know, I sued sorry, now I don't know how to correctly say this in English in legal terms, but we took the Commission to court over the taxonomy and what we think is an absurd greenwashing of the taxonomy by including fossil gas and nuclear. So there's a track record of us being very consistent in these questions, but let's focus first on what we can all do together in the next months.
Thank you. Herr Scheitz has raised the hand. Can you?
Ja, ich möchte kurz auf die Frage natürlich antworten. Ein Landkreis ist ja keine gesetzgebende Institution. Ich kann ja nur auf emotionaler Weise meine Kollegen hier auffordern. Und ich weiß, dass 2009 viele Landkreise, auch gerade in der bayerischen Region, diesen Weg gegangen sind und auch klare Stellung bezogen haben. Aber wir können eben nur emotional einen Denkzettel, sage ich mal, machen, aber die wichtigen gesetzlichen Vorgaben müssen natürlich Sie bzw. die Landesregierungen ausarbeiten und uns eigentlich vor diesem schützen.
Dankeschön. Yeah. Push the...
Like this. I like this. Okay. My name is Marcus Hustad, and I'm from Organic Norway, but here today I'm representing the GMO Network Norway. And we are an alliance of 18 different organizations comprised of youth organizations, environmental organizations, the organic sector, but also both of our farmers' unions in Norway. And I would like to say that from our perspective, we stand together and we stand firm in our rejection of this proposal, and we find it totally unacceptable. So it's not a question, but it's a good luck and hope for the best from outside of the EU. Thanks.
Can I ask, what would be the impact on the Norwegian legislation? You're a member of EFTA. How would the European legislation impact the Norwegian legal situation?
Okay, my name is Aina Bartman. I'm coordinating the network. So we think that it would be impossible for Norway to keep the very strict Gene Technology Act we have today. It would be hard to have an own definition if the proposal from the Commission goes through. So we really are eager that you will win this fight.
Okay, thank you. We'll do our best. Mareike?
Hallo, mein Name ist Mareike.
Mareike Inken. I work for Karl Beer, the Green German Member of Parliament, who has a constituency in Miesbach-Barkin in Bavaria. On what Mutter Schimpf said, there was a further decision as for Starnberg in trying to keep them GMO-free in the future. So it's good to hear that Starnberg has adopted a similar position. And just to Mr. Scheitz, there's a couple of questions I'd like to put to him. On the one hand, what can you do more precisely to encourage other local areas to take similar decisions? And further, how you see the debate in the CSU ramping up to the Bavarian elections and the ramifications that the position of CSU might have on the CDU. Thank you.
Herr Scheitz, ja.
Mr. Scheitz.
Ja, vielen Dank für die Frage aus meinem Nachbarlandkreis. Ich habe zuerst schon gesagt, wir können nur auf emotionaler Art und Weise praktisch den Leuten die Augen öffnen. Rechtliche Maßnahmen muss natürlich die Landesregierung bzw. Bundes- oder Europaregierung machen. Da sind andere gefragt. Wir können es emotional, wir können auch nur unsere Bürger aufrufen, hier anders einzukaufen, das Einkaufsverhalten verändern und einfach nur Augenmerk darauf legen, wie die CSU. Ich bin ja vorgestellt worden als Mitglied der CSU und ich kann Ihnen sagen, hier wird sehr unterschiedlich auch gedacht. Ich denke, das ist aber nicht nur in CSU-Kreisen so. Sie merken es, Landkreis Miesbach und Starnberg ist jeweils ziemlich, wie Sie sagen, auch in der CSU vertreten. Und wir nehmen alle Möglichkeiten wahr, die hier gehen. Und ich darf Ihnen sagen, viele unserer Abgeordneten denken so wie wir. Ich stelle die andere Seite nicht so fest. in Bayern wird schon so in diese Richtung gedacht, jedenfalls was das Süden Bayern bzw. das Oberbayern und das Allgäu betrifft. Also regional werden wir hier alles möglich machen. Nochmal, ich kann nicht andere Landkreise aktivieren, dass die können also Beschlüsse fassen, aber es sind halt leider nur Beschlüsse, die zahnlose Tiger sind, wenn sie nach oben nicht weiterkommen. Und für die Gesetzgebung sind andere zuständig und ich hoffe, dass diese Aufrufe, die die Landkreise momentan vor Ort auch machen, dass die auch ankommen und ich weiß, dass sie ankommen. Und deshalb bin ich ganz guter Dinge. Aber wir sind alle aufgefordert, dass wir diesen Weg gehen und dies immer wieder ansprechen und nur so kommen wir weiter.
Dankeschön.
Thank you.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Margaret Engelhardt from the Federal Agency of Nature Protection, Germany. I have actually a question to the European politicians on the panel, Madame Wiener and Mr. Clergot, if I may. Our experience as European environmental agencies in the last half year was that the Commission didn't listen to our warnings and our scientific inputs that these plants have impact on the environment. So I fully share what you're saying about that it is an erosion on the precautionary principle. My question now is, do you have the feeling that this way going forward in neglecting the precautionary principle will lead to a distrust of European citizens in the Commission? Because, also it was cited already that we have this survey saying that European citizens want to have safe food, want to have a protection of environment, but we don't come through with our early warnings here. So I wonder if this has also a, let's say, democratic European idea problem in it.
Ja, vielen Dank für die Frage.
Thank you for that question. Yes, it is indeed a problem. And I think there's a question of a loss of confidence in the Commission over this whole process, given the deregulation that's going to bring about, that they're trying to foist on us with SUR, sustainable use of pesticides regulation, SUR. That's also part and parcel of this. They're trying to make a deal here. So if you want to have pesticide reduction, then you have to have NGTs. Everyone's a winner, aren't they? But we know that through NGTs, pesticide use will actually increase. So it's incomprehensible that these topics are being linked in this way. So it is something that I have my hopes that some of those who've been fighting for decades against GMOs and facing these challenges, the questions that we're raising and the consequences that we believe will come about and the impact assessments, these are things that hopefully will be picked up on, will be addressed, and that we know that in society between 80 and 90% of people don't want genetic technologies, including NGTs. Hopefully the Europeans will be taken seriously, and that it's not a question of allowing a small handful of multinationals who will be taking our future from us. When I'm talking about food diversity, the diversity of tastes, of possibilities that are provided by seeds, the loss of seed resistance and plant resistance through this legislation. I'll leave it at that for now. As Mr. Scheidt, it's a question of an emotional response, but I am a member of Parliament, and I do think that in terms of civil society and working with countries and regions and environmental organizations, but also with farmers who don't want this, with people who enjoy eating, gastronomers, but also cooks, chefs, to say why we don't want this, what implications this will have, and if they are foreseeable, can we actually claw back these backslides that would come about from this? I think these are things that we need to look at, because we are messing with seeds. It's the cradle of life and may change life forever.
Christophe Clergeau will answer on the next panel that we are about to start now with you, Margret Engelhardt, and Ricarda Steinbrecher and Magda Stokjevic. And I thank you very much, and I also thank you for keeping a heart and keeping the heart on the right place, even within the European Parliament and even within the Austrian government. Very much pleased to have you here, and keep on fighting.
Of course.
Thank you. Will you bring your name tables there? Yeah, yeah. The next panel we are now entering into, we have headlined as a new narrative about GMOs, science and precaution. And we have a bunch of real experts on this. There is Ricarda Steinbrecher from ENSA, the European Network of Scientists for Social and Environmental Responsibility, who has been a critical voice, a critical scientific voice here since many years. And next to me, Margret Engelhardt, who has already introduced herself. She is in charge of the genetic engineering portfolio at our Federal Agency for Nature Protection in Germany. And this agency has produced a series of scientific assessments, especially with respect to the question of precaution and the impact of the potential impacts also of GMOs on the environment. And it's also my pleasure to have Magda Stokjevic with us, who is the campaign director of Greenpeace, the European unit, and has before already worked on this subject as well with Friends of the Earth. And I am also honored to have Pat Thomas with us from Beyond GMO, who is one of the co-organizers, actually, of this conference here, and will bring in the important UK experience that we have. And we will have later via video online Georg Buchholz, who has just analyzed the proposal from a legal point of view and will tell us quite a bit about the question of what does the precautionary principle actually mean, and where are the borders also even for a European Commission in ignoring this principle. And I'm happy that Ricarda will... sorry, I should introduce now Christophe Clergeau from the Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament. And we are very happy to have you here with us. And Christophe Clergeau is also what is called the shadow rapporteur on this dossier in the Environment Committee, which is desperately needed because the rapporteur in the Environment Committee, which is in charge of this dossier, unfortunately would not join us. We have invited her here, and we would have loved to have her with us and have her listen also to what we have to say, but she has no time for this, and also no other colleagues of her group were willing to go into a dialogue with us, which I deplore very much. And I think they should all look at the shining example of Mr. Scheitz, who has a probably quite different approach to democratic dialogue, even amongst those who disagree. Thank you very much. And the floor is yours, Ricarda, for introducing us now to the topic of, is there a new narrative? Is this really a change in the approach of the European Union on genetic engineering?
Thank you, Benny. Yes, I will address that question. Just to let you know, I'm a biologist and a molecular geneticist, and I've been working on the issue of risk assessment in GMOs since the mid-90s. And I'm part of the European Network of Scientists for Social and Environmental Responsibility. And as that, we have also produced an analysis of the proposal, and we were actually quite seriously taken aback because it's not evidence-based, nor is it scientific, but it's just a redefining of a GMO into now wanting to name it equivalent to a conventional bred variety. It is very interesting if we were to follow this. We've heard a lot about the precautionary principle already. Were we to follow that proposal, I bet you we will, in not too long in the future, end up as one of the chapters in Late Lessons of Early Warnings, the history of the precautionary principle, which has a lot of disasters in it because we fail again and again to listen and to do the right decisions. That's why we have the precautionary principle, because if something is new, as with these technologies, and if we want to do new types of applications with them, and if we have no practical experience in the field with it, we have no long-term evidence, no results, and the technologies, as the European Court of Justice also was saying, these technologies are rapidly developing, right? We have now a category of new technologies with an open end to what they will be. It might be CRISPR-Cas, it might be something completely different that's going to be used in the future, and they're all going to be exempted. I mean, that is completely unscientific and irresponsible. And if you are looking, for example, at the exclusion, they say like what they only want to include in Annex 1, we basically have Category 1 and Category 2. The way it's being defined, you can maneuver almost everything into Category 1 by allowing not just this 20 base pairs change, I come to that in a moment, but like 20 different modifications are allowed. They can be deletions, all at different places. As you know, with CRISPR-Cas, one can modify all the same gene in one go, like if you have wheat, if you have plants that have multiple chromosome sets, then you can just modify it, all of them at once, and you can modify another set of genes. So basically you can do 20. With that you can do an extreme amount of alterations, and something you could never do with breeding, but it's just being made equivalent. And why? Well, there is no relation to risk. I mean, that something is theoretically could be done with breeding, which I don't think it can, but that's a different question. But it has nothing to do with risks, nothing. Even one base pair change can be sufficient to make a plant produce a toxin again, right? Or can make a plant more vulnerable. So it is not like the size, for example, of a mutation, but where it is located that is important. These questions are not being asked here. Like, what has been changed? And what has been changed that was not intentional? Because that is what is being excluded here. If you look at it, all the process-induced mutations are explicitly excluded. CRISPR-Cas, for example, you need to get it into the plant, into the cell, and usually it's done, you use the gene for CRISPR-Cas and push it in like the old technology. You do a transformation, you get it into the plant, and the plant will then produce the molecule that then cuts the DNA. Well, that process of getting that gene included into the plant genome actually causes, according to papers from Wang and others, something like 10,000 different mutations, 300 to 400 of them even in genes. That was just 2021, researching in grapevine, just putting the CRISPR-Cas gene in without it being active, right? That was checked. Now, this is being excluded. Any kind of process-induced mutations are being included from it altogether. And if you look also at, for example, the whole area of cisgenesis, or of what is allowed to be changed, what can you import? There is that phrase in their breeder's gene pool. It's normally one would think, oh, it's what a small breeder works with, you know, and you just cross your plant with what it can cross, and fine, that would be safe. But here it's interesting. It can be anything that you can breed with. You don't even need to show that you can do it, but that you can theoretically breed it with, and you're allowed to do bridge crossings to get it there. So you can say, like, okay, I want this plant, which I don't know, it's a carrot, and I want to breed it with my maize. I don't know, anything. But I can use other plants as in-between goers to actually get to my plant. So when I theoretically can do that, the bridge crossings, then I can say, okay, it's part of the breeder's gene pool. So if I use a gene from that plant and put it in via cisgenesis, then I can do it. So you can see what's happened is category 1 has everything in it, and everything is deregulated. So basically, that's a deregulation of all new coming GMOs.
Thank you very much.
So much for the science.
Thank you. Margaret, you probably have some more data on this, actually.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, I have some slides because I thought I would like to show you also some data which are easier to show than to explain. So, yes, thank you very much, Ricardo, also to recalling us to the late lesson learned from early warning from the European Environmental Agency that, yes, that was one of the foundation of the precautionary principle. Actually, I want to add to this early warning now, and I want to also help us not to have to learn late lessons. So I said before also in my question that we do see that these applications in category 1 will have risks to environment, will have risks to the biodiversity and to the health. And these are core protection goals we have. And it is key that we keep them. But these are direct risks. There are also indirect risks if we can't keep the coexistence, because coexistence is also a guarantee for biodiversity, especially with small pharma, as we heard, for example, from this example from Bavaria, and also we heard earlier from Austrian colleagues that our diversity of species we use in the agriculture is threatening by this. So what I want to show you today is where will the path lead us. So let's us imagine the regulation is there, the new regulation. And we wanted to know, we are regulators, we do get the dossiers on daily life already now, and we want to know what will we do in future. So we will do in future or be involved in this assessment if these organisms fall under category 1 or 2. And please, first slide. So what we did is we took an analysis performed by the Swiss Agency for Nature Conservation, or commissioned. I will explain. which on plants that are on the horizon, so NGT plants that are in development. And they had 150 plants published, and we took every single plant and tried to be regulator at that time and said, are they category 1 or 2? It was difficult to get always the data. So these are the two colors. There's a darker color and a more shiny color. So in the darker color, we got the very secure data. We could really say it's category 1 and 2. We got the sequence and everything. In the more shiny color, we were pretty sure in our decision. So we could say, so the publication was, there was a mutation in a gene. So we could say, okay, this is also category 1, but we couldn't prove it because we didn't see the sequence. So just to say what we are talking about. So from these plants, we were able to evaluate 13 were transgenic, but the rest were NGT 1 and 2. And from this group, 94% were category 1 and only 6% category 2. And in a way, we think this will be even more extreme because once a developer, now that this new regulation is in place, they will try to develop their plants in the category 1. So, but already on the stuff that's already in the pipeline, 94% are category 1. Next slide, please. So when you look at these plants, we had a closer look on. Most of them were consumer-orientated. So, for example, they were non-browning. So when you have a mushroom, you cut it, you sell it, it browns quickly, and it looks nicer on the shelf when it is not non-browning. They were also like production-orientated. We call this industry-orientated. They were also on plant development and cultivation. It's easier to harvest them, for example. A smaller area were on biotic stress tolerance. That's on tolerant on insects, pests. There was also an area of herbicide resistance, and the smallest group was actually the one on abiotic stress, like drought tolerance. So what we hear now as the main reasoning for the development of this directive saying, well, there will be many applications that helps us to solve our current problems. Well, at the stuff that's currently in the pipeline, we couldn't see that. Next slide, please. Also, so far, we have 99% of the GMOs in 4 species. So soy, maize, corn, and cotton. And the future will be far more diverse. And that is a challenge to us as risk assessor because, of course, we don't have experience in these other plants. So we can't speak about a history of safe use. Okay, so that's what's coming. But coming back to this core question, are these applications that are most of them in highly diverse plant species and fall under category 1, so there's no risk assessment, no labeling. We will probably even don't have data to do the tracing because probably the applicant don't have to show us the data. So in this category 1, which is a fully deregulation, well, let's come back to the question, are there any application risky or not? I mean, why not? Maybe it's the same than breeding. Why not? Why not doing it? So let's look at it from a scientific perspective. And the main argument we see now, it's the same than breeding. Well, first of all, that's not true. There are many scientific details, and if we have time later on in the discussion, I can also show you a graph on that. There are many differences on classical breeding and this technology. But putting this aside, basically as a risk assessor, I'm not interested if it's similar to breeding. I'm interested if there are risks to nature, to biodiversity, to health. I don't care if this is similar to breeding or not. I care if there are risks. So what I look normally in transgenesis now at our current dossiers, I look, do the plants become invasive? Yes, of course, if they are drought tolerant, they can become invasive. Do the plants, they can also become invasive if you change carbon metabolism and fatty metabolism. Many of the traits are now in this direction. Yes, they become more cold tolerance and then have a better dormance in the soil, better survive the winter. By this, they can become invasive. They can become invasive and invade areas that are biological wealthy, because they're mostly these extreme areas with extreme temperature changes have a high diversity. So yes, and now these plants can invade them. We also have the problem that we now have transgenesis in wild grasses, for example. So we leave the agriculture system. We can have health problems. There's this GABA tomato that has an neurotoxic feature that is wanted to, that is lowering the blood pressure. But I want to know if I eat a tomato that's lowering the blood pressure. So, but okay, these are all examples. So I look at if it becomes invasive, if it becomes toxic to insects. Yes, if you have a changed secondary plant metabolism, it becomes toxic to insects. So, but now I want to show you the most extreme example. Next slide. It's a technical example. It's not the same than breeding. And it's something we digged out. It's not published yet, but however. It's called RNA interference. RNA is a piece of a little genetical piece that can, and if you look at the right at this insect, it can stick to genes of other organisms and silence them, and that means switch them off. And this is already used in transgenics. You can use it as an insecticide. So what you can do here, you have a plant, you put in these so-called RNAi genetic elements called RNA interference, and then an insect comes, eats it, and then it's switched off in an essential gene of this insect and it will die. So this is being used in transgenic organisms already as an insecticide. So normally we would of course look, would it also work as an insecticide in non-target organism, in organism we want to protect? But now we found out this can be done already with 2 times 20 base pairs. So with 2 times 20 base pairs change, you can switch off genes of organism who feeds on it. And I want to see the scientist who says this is the same than breeding and there's no risk. I want to see that scientist. Okay, next slide, please. Last thought I want to bring in is we have done together with 5 European environmental agencies, we have done a work if we can find good categories to do a per se risk assessment in this way of, is this something we really thought hardly? Okay, why not think about it really, 20 base pairs? Or think about different groups of organisms. And we came to the conclusion, no, we cannot say per se, in general, all these organisms, 20 base pairs, are not risky. We have published it. You see the link here with all our categories we checked. We have sent this publication, as many European environmental agencies, to the Commission, and we also presented it to the Commission. So we do think that this category 1 and 2 doesn't work. Last slide. So what is the path forward? For us, as an environmental agency, of course, the precaution principle needs to stay, and it can't stay with category 1. We cannot do a per se risk assessment. There are scientific risks around. The seed law won't do it. The seed law doesn't look on environmental effects. If we want to issue labeling and freedom of choice and coexistence, we cannot ensure this in the long run if we do deregulate category 1. We also find it important. There are many open questions we have still, and the Commission says we are going to answer them in delegated acts. And for us, the main things are in these delegated acts, and also I think instead of putting the energy there, we should strengthen the ecological risk and security research and the agroecological and small structured farming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for taking us through all these slides. And we move over to actually not only a politician who is emotional, but also a scientist who will give us a short impression of what the challenges will be for you over the next couple of months as a shadow rapporteur. Christophe Clergeau, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to speak French. Some people are putting their headphones on, others are taking them off. So I should like to thank my Green friends and colleagues for this invitation today. I should also like to greet everybody present and all speakers, including Corinne Lepage, who is someone I know already, and we're going to be meeting again. I think this is really a major challenge. We have already scored a new victory. What we're saying in France now is new GMOs. We're not talking about NGTs at all. New GMOs. And we want to have our basic discussion on that. So this is a victory, and I think that we are all going to be moving forward together, a true coalition. We're going to share roles so that we can convince the greatest number possible of MEPs and, of course, convince the public at large. Even within our own groups, I have to convince colleagues of mine who just say, well, it's an interesting technology. We should be able to use it. And why are some saying that? Because as we've heard, we are entering a period of climate disintegration, and we are seeing that many elected members of parliament are in despair at what they are seeing and saying, well, this, right, something possible, why not? And we need the why not, but we need to know the conditions which are going to apply if we go for the why not. I'm in favor of innovation, but the question which is put to politicians and society is, why do we have science, for what technological uses, and how do we protect society and the environment? And how can we do that in a context of acceptance of the very different and diverse people of Europe? So if we are convinced individually that the Commission's text is not based on evidence-based policy making, well, we the spokespersons for science, have to work very hard. We have to mobilize researchers and scientists to make sure that we make our statements clearly and loudly, the statements which we've heard today. We have this category 1 and category 2, which are crucial to the definition, and then we have to look at all the environmental impacts on biodiversity in particular, and on other crops, and all the unexpected results which we don't yet know. The impact of this, the specific impact of the genome, but also the genome as a whole, how it expresses itself and how it impacts on the environment. There's another issue which comes into play as well, and that is whether or not we should ban NGT 1 and or 2, this in connection of the use of pesticides or herbicides. And we see that the Commission changes position a few days down the road. Now, we saw on the slide just now a question that is put relating to category 1. What does it actually represent? And we've got the same figure today of new GMOs being in category 1. So in this category 1? Are we going to just brush aside 40 years of European construction of protection of the environment, protection of people, protection of crops, protection of those who don't want GMOs? This is a really crucial scientific issue, and it has everything to do with democracy. And just to wind up, I should just like to come back to what was said at the end and add something. Why does the Commission have the right to do everything and do it alone? The Commission could use delegated act to modify essential elements which are based on science rather than politics. So why are we talking about the issue of the viability of this? And the Commission said, oh, okay, well, we forgot to analyze the issue of patenting in this context. So I think that we could look at that, and we could look at this today without having the necessary information. Glyphosates, for example, we have an issue there where we are seeing decisions being taken ahead of the scientific analysis. They could use the safeguard clause. It's in the treaties. It's not a right to disobey. We could come up with facts to justify it, and we could discuss this with the Commission, and we could examine the different elements to see if there is any truth behind the issues which are raised, to see if it can be proven. So we've got innovation, science, and democracy, and we need a balance between those three elements. I, personally, I'm not going to say I'm for or against from a scientific point of view. What we need to look at is the whole procedure, at the end of which we can assess the situation and decide whether we are in favour or not, and then send this to the Commission.
Thank you very much. Very encouraging. And as we are running out of time, I just move over to Magda and the point of view of Greenpeace on this question.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I have 3 minutes. That's very challenging, so I may do 3.5 or 4. Bear with me. And I would like to start with challenging some of the narrative that we've been hearing around the NGTs and the products that are done with the new genomic techniques. The Commission claims very much that the NGT GMOs are there to increase sustainability, that they are there to ensure resilience of our food system, to support the European Green Deal goals. It specifically refers to climate resilience, pest resilient varieties, or plants that require less fertilizers and pesticides. Thank you very much, Margaret, for your slides. It seems that the industry haven't heard that because they are not having these parts in the pipeline. They have things that we know from the past, and they just want to call it differently and have it deregulated. I think let's call, how do you say that in English? A fish, and whatever. Maybe my English native speaker colleague can help. So these are claims that haven't been really put in practice and show that they can deliver. And they are not even in the pipeline to show us soon that they can deliver. So that narrative needs to be smashed, because that's a narrative. We are in climate crisis, and we are. We need to have a resistant food system, and we do. So let's have NGTs. I think this is not the answer. One may ask for that if the sustainability is really the objective, that genetically modified crops to achieve, or is it objective is different altogether? That's one that fits within industrial agriculture practices that we know for the last 20, 30 years. Of the industrial agriculture that actually goes into monocultures, fully dependent on the widespread use of herbicides like glyphosate. And that type of agriculture has proven risk to the environment, degradation of the environment, big changes in the livelihoods of the farming communities, and not delivering on the promises that it was having of healthy food. So again, an objective that is proclaimed here is not necessarily the one that is the real one. So in the industrial farming model, that's the one that we need to change. And if we talk about resilience, if we talk about food and food shortages, let's look at what really delivers resilience in food. Again, Margaret, you mentioned that sustainable agriculture, the agriculture that is conventionally able to deal with the shocks in the system. My second point goes to the precautionary principle and the potential risks, and a lot has been said here already. The precautionary principle can be described in two words. It's a codified humility. We should be ensuring that even if there is no scientific certainty, we are taking action because there might be risk that that comes here and that needs to be acknowledged and looked after. So for me, I was really shocked seeing the proposal that basically puts in the bin the precautionary principle, if I can put it that way, and talks about plausible risk hypothesis. I'm not sure, it's not defined, it's not clearly spelled out what it would be. Do we want to risk throwing away precautionary principle for plausible risk hypothesis? My organization is not. So the increased likelihood of interactions in this genetically modified plants, the risks that were mentioned here, the risks coming from the process to the environment are potentially huge, they are unknown, but they need to be mitigated, they need to be looked at. And I think if we don't have the process and the legislation that allows us to look at the risks, to make sure that we are aware of the risks, that we have labeling, that we have traceability, that we are able to know what's going on in the system, then we shouldn't release these plants in the environment. The risk is too big. The environment is already beyond the planetary boundaries. We've already destroyed a lot. And adding a burden is not going to help us in this time of the crisis, environmental and climate crisis. So the third and last point that I want to bring in is that the European Court of Justice ruling from 2018 is very clear in saying that the risks linked to the use of NGTs prove to be similar to the risks coming from production and release of all GMOs. In other words, both are GMOs and fall into scope of the GMO directive. It also concludes that excluding NGTs from the scope of the GMO directive would fall to respect the precautionary principle. So we are going to hear from a legal assessment, but it seems to me that that proposal goes against the ruling of the European Court of Justice, at least when it comes to the precautionary principle. For Greenpeace, this proposal from the 5th of July represents a deregulation and stays in contradiction with the objectives that the proposal claims to wants to achieve, which is maintaining a high level of protection of health and the environment. And for that very reason, it's not fit for purpose, and it simply should be dropped. This proposal shouldn't be there to stay. I'd like to finish with saying that very often when someone mentions GMOs, the industry or proponents say, we want to ban everything. No, we want to take the responsibility and make sure that there is a proper safety checks, that the GMOs are monitored, traceable and labeled, that people know if the GMOs are in their, in their food, and farmers know if what they plant or what is planted next to them has been done as GMO or not. These are very reasonable asks that that one may have, and we shouldn't really give in to that narrative of the industry that it's about banning everything, because that proposal we have shows that someone there didn't work that lesson of logical consequences of proposing what the Commission is proposing. This is deregulation as we speak. This is not regulating for the sake of environment and people. Thank you very much.
Pat, over to you.
Thank you, Benny. I'd like to begin with a quote. It's important to recognize the limits of science to solve fundamentally political questions. The challenges of wicked problems and the need for post-normal science call for science advice processes to be transparent and inclusive, as open and participatory beyond the scientific and political elites as possible, multidisciplinary, independent, and conducted with integrity. Scientific independence and integrity should be safeguarded from political interference, and scientists should act as honest brokers rather than issue advocates. Now, these words could have been written by Greenpeace, by Friends of the Earth, by Via Campesina, or even my own organization, but they come from a 2022 Joint Research Council report on the interplay between policy making and scientific research and the multiple limitations of so-called science-based policy. Science is, of course, important, but genetic engineering is not just a scientific issue. It is an ethical, environmental, social, economic, legal, and cultural issue. Creating regulation or indeed deregulation without giving equal weight to these concerns and the diverse risks that they represent is a procedural, policy, and political failure. In England, we have embraced this kind of failure. Abandoning foresight, transparency, and precaution, we have begun to implement some of the most liberal deregulation of NGTs in the world, with a view to eventually deregulating all GMOs in UK food and farming. And we have done this by making up names for things and inventing random and poorly defined categories and criteria that exempt certain GMOs from risk assessment, labeling, and traceability. Our new legislation is not yet fully operational, and we are watching the EU, rather like our colleagues from Norway, for its next steps, because the EU is a global regulatory power that has traditionally aspired to lead. Thanks to the so-called Brussels effect, the EU has set global benchmarks in rational, precautionary regulations around food standards, around online safety, around environmental protection, just to name a few. So it is beyond perplexing right now that the EU chooses to follow rather than lead, and worse, to follow the advice of issue advocate scientists. Equally perplexing, given the need to protect our environment and our food system, and the endless rhetoric about sustainability and food security, is its willingness to place its faith in a scientific process that is demonstrably incomplete, inconclusive, and uncertain. We are now in an Oppenheimer moment, contemplating dropping a bomb on our food system and on nature, with little regard for consequences, and justifying this with deficient science, disregard for ethics and environment, and nationalistic rhetoric about being innovators and winners. It's not too late to amend these proposals, and it is in the interest of all European citizens and citizens elsewhere to do so. Now, my fellow panelists have detailed, I think, quite fully the inadequate science and the empty promises underpinning these draft NGT proposals. Let me, a mouthy foreigner, be more blunt. Do not drop this bomb. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this advice. To wrap up this panel, we will hear from Georg Buchholz, who is a lawyer and has taken up a couple of GMO cases already and taken them even to the European Court of Justice. And he looked through the proposal with the pencil that the justice guys always have, and we will hear now from him where we are with this EU proposal for deregulation. Very welcome, Georg Buchholz. You have to ask to get the next slide if you want. Oh no, it's not. We don't have slides. Even better. Over to you. Welcome from Berlin.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Sorry. I hope the technique works. The reason why I am here is that I am just preparing a legal opinion on behalf of the Greens parliamentary group in the Bundestag, in the German Bundestag, for Mareike Imken, who has spoken before. That will be soon published. The focus of that legal opinion is the precautionary principle, as we heard before. One of the main starting points is that the Commission claims that the NGT proposal was coherent with existing GMO law, which is based on the precautionary principle. Well, when we look at the proposal and the precautionary principle, we can see that the precautionary principle is mentioned and confirmed in the explanatory memorandum, but not mentioned in the recitals, which are an important basis for the application and interpretation of legal acts. So that is not good, not convincing that they don't write it in the recitals. The precautionary principle, as said before, means, in the words of the European Court of Justice, that where there is uncertainty as to the existence or extent of risks to human health or the environment, protective measures may be taken without having to wait until the reality and seriousness of those risks become fully apparent. The precautionary principle is written in the EU treaties. They oblige the EU legislator to ensure a high level of protection based on the precautionary principle. But that's an important point. The judicial review is limited. The legislator needs to balance the precautionary principle with other objectives and principles he wants to follow. So the judicial review of the ECJ is limited to manifest errors of assessment by the union legislator. Anyway, I looked at the proposal and found a lot of violations of the precautionary principle, which were mentioned before. The first point is the risk blindness and the misleading comparison by the Commission. The second point relates to benefits of NGT. Third point to a lack of risk management. And the fourth point to an indefinite too broad scope of application. Risk blindness, first point. The classification of NGT plants takes place exclusively according to type and number of sequence alterations, and the resulting changes in properties and the associated risks are completely irrelevant, it was said before. And so there is no risk assessment for NGT1 plants at all and products thereof. It's only a status check if a plant is an NGT1 plant or not. A coherent privileging of NGTs with current GMO law would require that they pose no risks or lower risks compared to other GMO. But there is no scientific basis for this, as we have heard before, and as we have heard before, not only the ECJ, but also the Commission itself confirmed that the risks of NGT and other GMOs are similar. And the ECJ judged in 2018 a too broad mutagenesis exemption would therefore fail to respect the precautionary principle. So the same is true for NGT1, I think. Now to the misleading comparison by the Commission. The Commission justifies the exemption from GMO law with the comparability of risks of NGT plants with risks of conventional plants. That is an absolutely misleading approach. Exemption from GMO law requires comparison with other GMO because GMO law has never been justified on the ground that GMOs would pose higher risks than conventional organisms. I really looked at the history of German GMO law in the 80s and 90s of last century, and I found that the essential reasons for GMO law, which apply equally to NGT1 and NGT2, are the risks of humans and animals, as Margaret Engelhardt said before, and the risks for biodiversity. And they were compared in the 80s to invasive conventional species. So it's from the beginning of GMO law, it was not the thought that they may pose higher risks, but they may pose the same risks as conventional species, maybe like invasive species. So the comparison by the Commission is from the beginning absolutely misleading. It has nothing to do with the reason of GMO law. Now, look at the benefits of NGT. The Commission justifies the exemption from GMO law with potential benefits of NGT crops for sustainability, food safety, and autonomy of the European Union. In principle, greater benefits may justify restrictions of the precautionary principle. Let's look at the corona pandemic, where there were made exemptions, but the potential benefit of NGT is not greater than the potential benefit of other GMO, and the exemptions the Commission proposes are independent of specific benefits. They apply equally to NGTs that are harmful to the stated objectives. So the precautionary principle would only be justified insofar as specific benefits of NGTs in general or of individual NGTs in a case-by-case assessment can be demonstrated, which is not the case. Now to the lack of risk management for NGT1, which are totally excluded from GMO law. The risk management for other GMO, inter alia, includes pre-release risk assessment, evaluation and authorization, traceability and labeling, monitoring by responsible persons, by a monitoring plan, official controls, ordering powers and a safeguard clause, and opt-out from member states. For NGT1, none of these risk management measures do apply. There are no general requirements for safety of NGT. Even product safety law is not applicable for plants. There's no possibility of status rejection if we know that an NGT1 plant is dangerous, and there's no special intervention basis if we realize that an NGT1 is dangerous. There's only general product safety, food and feed and regulatory law. The food law, to the detriment of food businesses, e.g. in case of risks from accidental and unintentional contamination with NGT products, would work against the food businesses and not against the inventors or the persons who released the NGT1 into the environment. So last point, the vague too broad scope. The proposal of the Commission conceals the risks of NGT plants. The scope is determined, as said before, only by the type and number of DNA alterations. So first the legislative bodies, but also the food businesses, the consumers and other members of the public cannot judge the potential risks of these plants. There are many imprecise terms, e.g. for NGT1, it begins with targeted mutagenesis. How accurate, how precise must the target be and met? There's, for NGT1, there's a sequence similarity required, but what % of what sequence length must be similar? It is required a bioinformatic predictability, but how accurate must this predictability be, especially regarding unintended aspects? The consequence is that there is a potentially boundless scope of application, as Margaret Engelhardt has shown before, exempted from GMO law at all. So the conclusion is this is a completely one-sided and unbalanced proposal from the Commission. And my legal conclusion is that the regulation would be void due to the violation of precautionary principle because there are manifest errors of assessment and there is no scientific basis for the exemption of NGT from general GMO law. And last point, there are, from my point of view, a lot of other open questions regarding civil liability. So the question is if there is a risk assessment obligation according to general liability law, and who might be obliged to do this risk assessment. I think of a general liability for producers of NGT1 plants and products, but also of the liability of food and feed businesses who use NGT1. And next point, the information obligations in the business-to-business seller-buyer relationship beyond labeling requirements. So does a seller who sells NGT1 plants have to inform the buyer? Does the buyer have to ask the seller? What is if there are risks occur? Who is responsible? Which insurance will pay? I think all these are questions for the businesses which have to be addressed. So thank you from my point.
Thank you very much. I have to apologize to you. I couldn't help overspending time while we were listening to really interesting interventions. We have to make up for that time. But when I look at your faces, I feel skipping the short break would be a mistake, actually. And so I would ask you to shortly stand up, stretch, grab a coffee, grab a cookie, and directly come back so we can make up for some of the time. Thank you very, very much for all the really helpful interventions in this round. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, hello, hello, hello. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats again. You can grab your coffee, bring it with you, bring the cookie with it, but please stop talking, come here now. And hello, come back please, sit down. Hello. Can you get the people back, please? Push them. No? Yes? Yeah. Yeah. 10 minutes before 6 you have to leave. Okay. Right. Yes, you will be speaking first, and you probably have to. No problem. I'm sorry, it's my fault. But, okay. It doesn't work. I have to push the people back in.
You recall.
Oh, okay. Good. Good to see you.
No, I'm afraid not. Hey, Jane. Nice to see you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, in fact, I missed entirely the.
I was in another event now, so.
I know. Well, I missed because there was no translation with the connection from outside Poland. So they may.
So, our second panel that we are starting with is still a slight delay, so people please stick to the minutes now, is about transparency and traceability. We've heard quite a bit about this already. It is about consumers' rights, but we will hear that it is not just about consumers' rights, but it is also about liability, it is about traceability, it is about business as well. And we will start with an insight from Michel Habetz from the Rathenau Institute, who looked at the attitudes of Dutch citizens on these new GMOs. And from a German perspective, right, the Dutch are the ones who believe that nature is an invention of humans, actually, and are one of the most food and also agriculture technology friendly approaches within Europe. And so it is really interesting to learn what Michel Habetz and her colleagues at the Rathenau Institute found out about the attitudes. And the floor is yours, and we're very honored to have you with us, Michel. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Will there be any slides? Because I did. Oh, great. Okay, thanks. So thanks for inviting me, and I'm sorry I'm not there in person. It sounds like there's a really nice atmosphere, people not wanting to come back.
You're missing quite some fun here.
I would like to share some findings, indeed, of a study we've done examining the views of Dutch citizens. Because although, of course, the topic of the conference is GMOs or new genomic techniques and why and how we should regulate these, we're, of course, also talking about the future of our food. And that is why it's important that we include citizens. Next slide, please. So the Rathenau Institute, together with Wageningen University and Research, examined how a cross-section of Dutch citizens view the use of new genomic techniques in crops and foods in focus groups. And I'd like to emphasize here that we investigated the views of people as citizens, so not as consumers. And there's an important difference, because while as a consumer, we may opt for inexpensive products in a supermarket, perhaps because we have no choice. And while many consumers may not read labels, that does not mean that as citizens, people don't have concerns that reach further than their behavior at the supermarket would suggest. Because citizens do have concerns outside of their market relationship. And identifying people only as consumers reduces the complex and diverse identities of citizens. Next slide, please. So I would like to start off with just one of the important findings, and that is that in our study, we didn't find that participants saw these NGTs as any different from genetically modified crops. And that, of course, stands in stark contrast to the dominant frame that argues that it is relevant that NGTs have small changes that could have occurred in nature or through traditional breeding. But citizens, they argue instead that, yes, it may be the case that these plants only have small changes that might occur in nature or through traditional breeding, but the fact is these changes didn't occur in nature, and it didn't occur through traditional breeding. And so the process is actually important and relevant for citizens in our study. And they subsequently reflected on the fact that equating these NGTs with traditional breeding, and they talk about it and they say, well, maybe that's done for political reasons, maybe it's done for marketing reasons, maybe they just want to get rid of these NGTs of a bad connotation. Next slide, please. So citizens talked very nuanced way in our focus groups about the NGTs. And in general, they were very open to the idea that these new genomic techniques could provide solutions for specific problems in agriculture, like infections or plagues. And they see the opportunities that these techniques can afford. Most people weren't in principle opposed, but there was very little enthusiasm for introducing the NGTs in food crops. And there are basically three reasons for that. So first of all, citizens have doubts about the long-term safety of these techniques. They've seen in the past that introduction of technologies, and whether that's cars or whether it's Airbnb, it leads often to unintended and unforeseen negative consequences. And so they wonder why it would be any different with this technology. And moreover, they say these current challenges that we're dealing with, like nitrogen disposition, decreased biodiversity, also the impoverished soil, they're actually seen by citizens as having been caused in part by this intensification of agriculture and technologies. And so solving these problems with yet another new technology is just seen as a temporary solution that is likely to generate unintended and unforeseen side effects in the long term. And people also expect that their governments to put only products on the market that have been assessed for risk, especially when it concerns food. And second, citizens worry that these NGT plans are unlikely to contribute meaningfully to solving current challenges. They doubt whether NGT crops will provide the solutions because they do not see how they would solve these complex and multidimensional causes that underlie the current predicaments. So citizens will, for example, mention that there is this unfair distribution of food in the world, and much land is used for growing food for our livestock. And they just don't see how, like new genomic techniques is going to, deal with that problem. And a third argument that we found when they talk about NGTs is that they doubt that companies will indeed produce crops that contribute to solutions to our societal problems. And on the contrary, their experience with companies actually shows that these commercial interests are more important. And so they wonder why it would be any different here. So they commonly mistrust the motives, but also the capacity of companies to respond to societal challenges. And they believe instead that these new genomic techniques will just be used for cooperation for short-term commercial benefits. And it's actually precisely these commercial benefits that they don't find acceptable as a goal for new genomic techniques. Next slide, please. So in light of these views, it's of course unsurprising that we found that the citizens that we spoke with, they were unanimous in their view that NGTs need to be regulated. They were also unanimous in their views that these NGTs need to undergo an environmental risk assessment before reaching the European market. And they were unanimous in their view that these new genomic techniques, or the crops, the products from them, need to be labeled. And we don't really have any reason to believe that if a similar study were done in other European member states, that the results would be any different. Next slide, please. So how do we anticipate that citizens would react to the current proposal on the from the European Commission? Now, based on the findings, we would say that there's probably very little enthusiasm among citizens for the current proposal as it stands, because, of course, they're in favor of this risk assessment and the labeling. And we actually found that the more citizens were talking about the use of new genomic techniques in agriculture, the more they realize that although the technology itself might have this great potential, the potential will not be realized if the structure of our society doesn't encourage it. And it's the lack of trust in the developers' motives and goals and a lack of confidence that the technology will in practice solve societal challenges that kind of builds their view. So just briefly, what would be our advice to the members of the European Parliament based on our study? Next slide, please. So we would think that, making assessment of risk to human health and the environment a requirement for market approval would be a good idea, just based on what we found that citizens in our study would say. And we also found that preserving the freedom of choice is very important for our citizens. And last, we think that having this broader assessment of ethical, cultural, and socio-economic aspects are important, because citizens are concerned about safety, are concerned about increased corporate control, increased inequality in the food system, and a loss of consumer choice. So there is a lack of trust also in the capacity and willingness of politics and corporation to respond to societal challenges, and in the capacity of free market to bring valuable products. And so if you would make it a requirement that only valuable products would come onto the market, I think that would really build trust with citizens. And that's kind of what I wanted to tell you about our study. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us. And I move over to Fabrizio Fabri, an old colleague of mine who is representing the consumers' cooperatives in Europe, Eurocorp, and who will bring us a view on the retailers' aspects on this new proposal. And the floor is yours, Fabrizio.
Thank you, and thank you for having invited us second year. Last year we already presented our position. I won't indulge too much on the first. It's just Eurocorp is representing the consumer cooperatives across Europe, not only EU. And we have the second, all the co-ops together represent the second largest retail force in the EU. So we are quite consistent. Over 30 million members are owning exactly the co-ops. So the co-ops are owned by their own member. Just to give you an idea, co-ops have been all, next slide, please. Co-ops have generally been a front runner in opposing GMOs, the first generation, I would say. There have been many members who have actively campaigned against it, have committed themselves for labeling with internal auditing and certification systems which guaranteed that all the consumers were able to choose freely the products they purchased. On the base of that policy position, as a secretariat, I developed a position on NGTs, which basically has been presented to our member in September 21, by which I derived our position paper that has been submitted to the Commission through Have Your Say portal. Next slide, please. After that, there have been next slide, please. After that presentation in 2021, that position has been a bit challenged by some members, saying maybe that we have to look better whether NGTs may offer basically a solution to make food productivity for production more sustainable. On that, we have launched an internal questionnaire. Next slide, please. That has been sent to all the members. We had just a few of them answering to that questionnaires. And basically, we have put forward some questions to our member, which concerned the ex-ante and ex-post risk assessment, traceability and labeling, the relationship with the imported food. And we can see on that slide, as you can see, the majority of the respondents have been supportive for the original position taken by the Secretariat, saying that NGTs have, in fact, to be treated as GMOs. Apart from COP UK, that has been conditioned a bit by the ongoing national legislation. That won't be affected by the EU legislation, and basically because there is a very strong crisis, food crisis in UK. They have short in supplying. So they are struggling with that supplying. They are not in a position to take strong actions against. But as you can see, when it comes to traceability and labeling, even COP UK, based on the information they got from their consumers and from their customers and members, or even in UK, they ask traceability and labeling. So it is a prerequisite, it's a minimum common denominator that involves all the COPs. Next slide, please. When it comes to patent research and disclosure of traits, that it comes a bit on the way previous intervention, why we don't ask to disclose the technique and the trait, just simply because they don't want. Anyway, our members, in fact, are absolutely in favor of a disclosure of the traits change for technologies in order to allow the national agency to make their job, actually, and be able to detect the presence of NGTs either authorized or not. On the research, we are mostly all of our members are, in fact, more inclined to soft biotechnologies like marker-assisted selection, microsatellite, and other techniques, and we're not patents applied, of course. So next slide. Based on that internal consultation, I would say that the Secretariat, Eurocop Secretariat, has reinforced this position. So in terms of at the EU level, Eurocop is ready to join in any battle that will be eventually started next month, coming next during the negotiation. And I will continue to gather other members' support to this position, and will continue to assist those COP members, especially Norway, the Scandinavian countries, which have been particularly active and concerned by the proposal, just as well as other members who want to join in. And eventually, I will invite them to join other coalitions for national levels to increase the critical mass. Thank you.
We've heard quite a bit about the special challenges to organic farming and processing, and we have Bernard Lignon with us today, who is a vice chairman of IFOAM Organic EU, and works for Synabio, the French organic processors organization, and we will hear from this perspective how important traceability and labeling actually are.
Merci Benny. Alors juste une petite.
Thank you, Benny. Just a bit of detail. I'm a member of the board, but I'm not vice chair of Europe. Just a little bit of detail. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Organic Europe would like to ensure that GMOs, including those from NGTs, are subject to a choice for people in Europe. We want this to happen in the context of Directive 2018. We do feel that NGTs should be prohibited for the purposes of organic farming, even if we're looking at adapted technologies. In fact, the Commission is providing for existing rules to be used in Member States to ensure that there is no cross-contamination. Furthermore, apart from this not being harmonized, Member States are no longer going to have the possibility of prohibiting NGTs throughout their territory. So this means that they're going to lose a part of their current national sovereignty, which allows them to prohibit NGMs today. For NGTs 1, the obligation of labeling is only for seeds. Realizing that the consumer doesn't eat seeds, these measures are not adequate. They are also inadapted insofar it's not going to be possible to detect the NGTs by analyzing the product. So the possibilities for coexistence necessitate certain measures which are not within the proposed regulation, i.e. the capacity for Member States to be able to prohibit all NGTs if they so wish, the systematic labelling of products which come from NGTs. There should be an obligation to provide notification for identification of the NGTs and labelling throughout the production of such, and also certain measures, in particular the establishment of a liability system, which is a strict system, and also a system whereby farmers can be informed if there is contamination. In most cases, if there is accidental presence, it's impossible to establish the cause, and therefore there is a lack of liability. We need a proper and well-adjusted legal framework, but it's not up to the consumers and organic farmers to take this on board. The public authorities cannot thus reverse the burden of proof to the detriment of the biological filières, as is the case for pesticides. This is going to lead to supplementary and quite considerable additional costs. If there is cross-contamination, the administrative costs to prove the conformity of the goods reserved, without talking about fraud in the case of patenting. So we might have an operator asking the supplier if the product is NGT, and may get the response that this product is in accordance with the NGT rules. Another example, if a seed provider has 10 clients, which themselves provide 10 clients, only 11 operators under the current system will provide the operation. Otherwise, we're going to have 110 operators who are going to have to look for the information, and this would, of course, mean additional costs. We need to have a system of identification and traceability and all other measures which will ensure that organic farmers and conventional farmers will be able to continue to ensure that there are no GMOs throughout the whole supply chain, and that the costs are not borne either by them or by the consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker in this panel will be Tilly Metz, representing a traditionally critical country to the GMOs. So, please, Tilly.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. And I co-hosted it also, but now I've switched too much of events.
Thank you for inviting us.
Okay. So the Commission, we had already mentioned the precautionary principle. That was already mentioned. Why this Commission proposal is definitely not okay. But it's not only that. The Commission proposal is to forgo really the labeling of the GMOs is also in direct contradiction with Article 8 of the EU General Food Law from 2002, which guarantees the consumer's right to make really informed choices. And when I was listening now to Michel Havertz, I would again say, but let's listen here to the wisdom of the citizens, to what they are saying and the producers. And EU consumers are very clear. They do not want, and we saw it in the presentation, they do not want genetically modified foods on their plates. So the existing transparency and also labelling rules for GMOs have led to far-reaching market rejection of GMO foods in the European Union. More than 60 GMOs can be or could be imported into the EU as food and feed, but there is so little demand that you will not find GMO-labeled products in the supermarkets. So, of course, there we have on the other side, when we speak now about GMO feed, that is a little bit another issue, as there is no obligation to declare that animals have been fed with GMOs. Well, that is something we, and I'm looking especially also at Martin, something we have been fighting for, but well, maybe right now that goes a little bit too far for today. But what we can really say that it is a vast majority of consumers does not differentiate really between GMOs, the traditional GMOs or the so-called NGTs, new, there are genetic modification, and that is very clear, and they want to have the right to be informed. During the consultation period in 2021, more than 60,000 EU citizens responded that they wanted to keep the new generation of GMOs regulated and labelled as GMOs. So why the Commission is not taking into account really what the citizens are saying? Regarding now the traceability, I think there is quite some paradoxical message running around. So here really you see the absurdity of the proposal. We are being told that the new GMOs are just like the conventionally bred plants. So don't worry, they will not have any undesired impact on health or biodiversity. But at the same time, they are inventions by big agribusinesses, and they would like to have patents for that. So that is a little bit a contradiction regarding to traceability, because on the other hand, they want to have the patent. We are, of course, very clearly against patents on food, but that also means that this big business will be able to track and trace the genetical modification in order then to protect their financial interests. So in short, the tools to trace these new GMOs would remain in the hands of big players making money off them. So for farmers, food producers, retailers, there would be a complete lack of transparency, which would of course be a particular threat for the entire, and we heard it, for the entire organic sector, which has to remain. It's also paradoxical, by the way. If it is like conventional, on the other hand, they are saying clearly, but organic has to be 100% GMO-free. But also independent researchers and public authorities would be left in the dark. So how are we going to keep an overview on the spread of these new GMOs in nature and also the potentially growing developments once they are released? So of the millions of euros the EU spent on new GMO research in the past years, only 1.6% was spent on detection methods, risk assessment and monitoring. So I really like the quote now. If you don't look for problems, you rarely find them until it is too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tilly. I think this left no questions open. And you probably know what I'm aspiring to. I think we have to do a flying change of the panel. Madame Lepage needs to even leave a little early. Dr. Häusling told me he must be going at 6 o'clock, and we only have half an hour left. I would like to invite the panelists to our last panel, where we ask ourselves, what are the overall impacts of this now that we know the labeling is necessary, the science behind this distinction between new and old GMOs is actually flawed. What is the impact on the different food and agricultural systems? And there we have an old fighter on this issue with us, Corinne Lepage. We have Erika Olsson, who is a Swedish farmer and will join us hopefully in a second. I don't know where we lost her. We have Martin Häusling, you've already heard of them, and we will have Isabel Sommer from the Swiss Alliance on Genetic Engineering, who is also a co-organizer. Unfortunately, due to COVID, it's back again. She has to join us via video. Madame Lepage, the floor is yours. I don't have to introduce you too much, but I should probably mention that you have been an environment minister in France, that you have been a long-standing member of the European Parliament. You have been the Parliament's rapporteur on the opt-out decision on GMOs, and you're still running a advocacy office which focuses a lot on pesticides as well. So please, the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Chair. Well, at the risk of disappointing you, I am going to change what I was going to say, following on what has been said this afternoon. I'm going to be challenging because, quite honestly, when I listen to these discussions, this is what we had 30 years ago in 1995. In 1995, I was Minister of the Environment, and I was at the European Council. And when the Americans tried to impose GMOs on us, because that's what happened, there was a blockage of our ports to allow GMOs in. And it was exactly the same issue that's being raised today. The precautionary principle was not as developed as it is at the moment. The European Environmental Agency didn't exactly come up with five-star reports. And as we've heard this afternoon, the precautionary principle, if the precaution comes in too late, it doesn't work. And we're talking about the 2022 issues now, which have arisen. And we need to ask whether this is going to have an impact on other plants. Is this going to have an effect on human health? Is there a problem of whether or not patents can be granted? And I think that quite honestly and quite definitely and seriously, I must say that all the questions posed then had the wrong type of reply, because everything that we didn't want happened. And what we have had to do is to rebuild right to protection with three major features. First of all, the right of member states to refuse, to reject. It took time, but it happened in 2015 or 2016. And I drafted what was perhaps the first report. Detailed studies in the implementation of the precautionary principle, even if in reality we are still, for GMOs, fairly far away from the precautional principles as defined by the European Court of Justice in 2019. And long-term studies are, in fact, not ready. So the third point is, of course, labeling. Labeling for consumers. Not labeling for the producers, for the consumers. I think that member states and consumers are always overlooked. So what have we done in the last 30 years? Quite honestly, we have been caught short by this. If we look at the decision of the Court of Justice of 2018, even the 2021 decision wasn't good. And we've seen people getting around the rules on patenting. We've seen diversion from the rules for consumers who don't want GMOs. And we're not talking about those who don't want NGTs. And also, people have managed to avoid risk evaluation and the implementation of the precautionary principle. And I shall wind up by pointing out that there is a really basic rule here, and that rule entails visibility. So, can we go backwards, or should we not go backwards? And in 1976, I think it was, 1996 or 1997 in France, I got a rule in France in the end relating to visibility, because visibility is something which is important for all of us. We need to know whether there is a considerable risk, whether it poses a risk for future generations. And this is something which is important for this, as it is for all other foods. I think that public opinion needs to be informed. And quite frankly, in France, nobody's informed. Nobody talks about this as a subject. So really, they are not up to date on the news and environmental law. So, unfortunately, I can't stay until the end, but thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Madame Lepage. It's been a real honor to have you here, and we fully understand that you have to catch your train. And so I hand over to the next generation with Erika Olsen, who is an organic farmer in Sweden and also an important member of the Organic Farmers Organization in Sweden as well. Please, over to you.
Thank you so much. My name is Erika Olsson, and I have a farm south of Stockholm, Sweden. It's an organic farm, and it's a family farm. I run it together with my husband and my children. And I think that you as a farmer really live in the history, in the present, in the future, on the same time, every day. On my farm, I can see the traces from my ancestors who lived on the farm 1,000 years ago. As well, I can see the trees that were planted 100 years ago or 50 years ago that still gives me fruit. And what I do and don't do every day, it sets the scene for my son, who really wants to become a farmer in the future. And I think that's why I and a majority of the organic farmers in Europe really want to have the opportunity not to choose NGTs. And I think it's good that the proposal from the Commission bans NGTs in all organic production. Because consumers, or should I say citizens, who buy organic products, they expect that no genetic engineering has been used in the production. Assimilating NGTs to conventional breeding with no traceability would amount to imposing their use to all farmers, including me, or including organic farmers. And this would undermine the reputation of organic products, and it would have negative economic consequences in a time where the organic market already has a tough time because of the inflation. Another thing that really concerns me is the impact of the NGT deregulation on the issue of patent. The mandatory traceability system established by the current legalization on the GMO allows for clear identification and information on whatever a given genetic material or product falls within the scope of a patent claim. And this allows breeders and farmers to avoid using such material, and therefore we are therefore protected from legal threats related to patent or from paying royalties to patent owners. Sorry, I envy all you who can speak in your own language. When you take plants and material protected by a patent and you take away the traceability, that exposes all actors from in this food supply chain to significant legal uncertainty. And that's why we cannot do, or it really affects what we can do or cannot do with our plants and animals. And I'm afraid that access to plant breeding materials might be significantly restricted. And this is a threat to the European model of innovation in the breeding sector, which relies on a lighter form of intellectual property rights that allows the circulation of genetic material. And this will lead to harmful concentration in the seed sector. Maintaining traceability is the key point. I'm afraid that this proposal might have negative effects for the coming future farmers that are not possible to go back to where we were before. So my request to all policymakers is, please pay full attention to who will be the winner and the loser with this proposal. According to me as a farmer, I think access to genetic resources, the preservation of a gene pool free from genetic modification or monopolistic intellectual property rights, and an independent breeding capacity is the key for the future. So please, don't shut the doors for the farmers to come. This is really an important point, and you need, all of you who are involved in the process, please consider what we are doing. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Isabel Sommer is the new head of the Swiss Alliance on Genetic Engineering, who has been an ally since a long time. And as you know, Switzerland has always been the land of the moratorium on GMOs, but also there is a new debate on new GMOs and to what extent the moratorium and the ban on cultivation of GMOs in Switzerland actually will hold. And we will hear a little bit from Isabel about this and about the Swiss debate that has just unfolded. Please.
Thank you, Benny. So it's a pleasure to be with you, even though remotely. As Benny said, my name is Isabel Sommer. I'm Managing Director of the Swiss Alliance for GMO-free Agriculture. We are an umbrella organization with about 25 institutional and 2,000 individual members. So yes, in Switzerland, there has been a moratorium in place on GMO since 2005, following a yes vote on a popular initiative. So this means that genetically modified organisms may only be cultivated cultivated for research purposes. In 2022, that moratorium was extended again until the end of 2025, but the Swiss Parliament has mandated the Federal Council to develop a regulatory proposal for NGTs by mid-2024. So we now expect this deadline to be extended, actually, because obviously it is very relevant for Switzerland to look at the upcoming regulation in the EU. But nonetheless, we are quite worried because the Federal Council will probably come up with a proposal which is very similar to the EU draft proposal. So that is why we tried to mobilize and were successful to mobilize a broad alliance of around 60 supporting organizations to intervene in the debate with a position paper that clearly shows our red lines that should not be crossed. So our most important demands are strict regulation of NGTs in the existing Swiss genetic engineering legislation. That is important because there is a call for regulation outside of the specific regulation based on the claim that new GMO are just not GMO at all. Then also we have some demands on the freedom of choice and transparency, coexistence, liability, and generally an expansion and promotion of socially just, climate and biodiversity friendly food systems. So we expect the next round of discussions in one of our parliamentary commissions at the end of this year. And as also our colleagues from Norway said earlier, Switzerland is closely monitoring discussions in EU and likely is going to follow lead. So therefore, I just also want to take the opportunity to thank everyone here today for their engagement for GMO-free Europe, as this will also clearly affect any decisions in Switzerland. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then the last word goes to Martin Häusling, our host here and also an organic farmer.
Ja, vielen Dank. Die Position.
Thank you very much. Now, organic agriculture, I think, has been presented on a number of occasions. I don't need to reiterate that. Now, I have to say I'm very pleased about this conference, but when we sit in certain configurations, we're on our own. Sometimes you get some social democrats on board, some Greens, and others who are saying, oh, hang on, we do need this. We need to join science around the world. This is innovation. And when we look at huge innovation, what is it exactly that's in the pipeline? Well, you've got these tomatoes, which are meant to reduce blood pressure. In the press conference, some people say, well, my blood pressure's too low, so I need to know what sort of tomatoes I'm going to be eating. Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? Secondly, you've got lettuce that should never turn brown, bananas that don't rot. You know, there used to be an anti-rotting tomato. And all these promises are things we've heard during the course of our discussions, and everything comes back in a new packaging, new GMOs. That's the future. That's science. Then you can add to it another killer argument against that people who are against the new GMOs are against science. Well, all the scientists in Germany are in favor of genetic technology, they say. But then you look behind that and you realize there are a lot of them, yes, but there are a lot of industrial and business interests there. There are a lot of people in favor of patents because they're going to earn money. So it's not neutral science. It's not in favor of some sort of higher attempt to reach nirvana. It's actually business interests behind this. So you can't be called out to be against science when this is the case. Now, we have to say that we might not be in a majority. We might not be loud in the committees either. You've got Copa Cogeca, you get other people saying, no, we have to go along these lines. And so at the end, you have a result where Mr. Timmermans, who said in the committee, Mrs. Kyriakides is saying we need new breeding techniques, need genomic techniques, because we want to reduce pesticides. in all seriousness, they both said that at the same time. I mean, you can say it however many times you want. Look at the US. It's not happening. Nevertheless, it's a mantra that's being trotted out again and again. We've talked about the organic sector here today. That's clear. I had a fight against Mr. Hogan for a long time. Together with Hannes, we had that fight that new genomic techniques shouldn't end up here. But then we look at the market, 16 billion products, GMO-free. And then you look at the conventional sector and how is that going to fare? That's going to be destroyed. So I think we need to work together. We need to make sure there's an impact assessment. Look at the industrial impacts in terms of sales in both conventional non-GMO sectors if this were to come into force. The business losses we're talking about, I mean, organic, obviously, we have to fight against pesticides, and then we're going to have to try and guarantee that they're GMO-free. So this isn't on. And I think this needs to be made clear. In the organic sector especially, we need to be well aware of the dangers. But what do we need? And in many of the discussions over recent weeks, I've noted, we need a new discussion in society. There are many people here who have been fighting long and hard against GMOs. We get this situation where people are saying, yeah, science needs to be used, we've got climate change, we can't turn our backs on science. I think this is a discussion that needs to be taken to the people. We need to talk to people, consumers, but also farmers. We can't say that things are going to change simply because of climate change and therefore we have to do things differently in those terms. It's very clear that there are risks that some people deny still. So I will take this away with me as a strengthening our hand. We're both shadows in the Environment Committee, and we'll have to get civil society support there. But I'm from sounding out this committee, it seems like conference, it sounds like we've got a lot of support. I think we can already start preparing our 11th conference. We mustn't give up. I would call on all of you who are here, take this message with you. We need to continue this discussion. We need to make sure that the Commission has to count on getting some stiff resistance from organisations such as the ones you represent, consumer organisations, farmers organisations. And, you know, it ain't over till it's over. Of course, things still need to be done, but I remember, and I'm sure you know as well, back in 2003 as well, we can't stop it, everybody's going along, there's nothing we can do, GMOs are going to come to Europe, whatever you do. Now, we can be proud today that there's even a competitive advantage for European agriculture that we didn't do that, and we didn't destroy ourselves, so thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you, Martin.
Wir haben sehr viel gehört.
Yes, we've heard a great deal now. Things that should encourage us, give us some new ammunition in our discussions. I'd like to thank especially Margaret Enerard. These new ideas, the definition of NGT1, allow pesticide issues to come to the market with pesticide effects without any kind of risk assessment being used. I think we have a common enemy. We hear from the Spanish presidency, and that is time. So industry, as well as the proponents of this form of deregulation, are counting on this whole issue being forced through before large parts of the population wake up and see what's going on, that it will be done and dusted before the debate for the next European elections next year will actually kick off. The fact that there are governments could agree to this new legislation, even though they're fully aware that there would be a large majority of their citizens who would never accept this. If we were to compare what is going on in the Netherlands with the Dutch government and then what we heard about the views of the Dutch citizens, we can see there that that is the real danger with this proposal. That if it were to become clear that people have to wake up and realize what's going on before the debate starts, then it's going to be a bit tight. And that is why I think it's all the more important that straight away, next week, we start this discussion wherever we can. We start addressing these issues. In Germany, at home, I've seen the fact that there tend to be concerted actions, articles that appear that are basically saying there are people who want to turn the clock back, they're against genetic technologies all the time. There's a big debate within the Greens as well about there are some who are open to genetic technology and genetic modification. There are voices going along those lines. But it's not a question of whether you're in favour or against the use of genetic modification. It is a question as to whether in future you will know whether it's been genetically modified or not, whether you can do anything about eating GMO-free at all, whether you can farm your land without GMOs and provide food without GMOs. That is a different debate. That is a debate about transparency, it's about fairness, it's about trust. And if those who are convinced that this new CRISPR-Cas method or the old genetic modification techniques are providing such an important contribution to our future to combat poverty, combating hunger in the world, they say, adapting to climate change, overcoming the crisis in biodiversity, then they should be proud that there is a public communication of that. If they're trying to get things through behind our backs, they're doing it suspiciously for good reasons. And all of these highest standards of science go by the wayside. Transparency and openness are a precondition for us to reach an agreement in society about which techniques are being applied, which risks we may be prepared to accept, to entertain, to defend ourselves against other risks. Now, if that's all going to be poisoned, then the European Commission, the majorities that we've seen formed, those in the committees who are already convinced, the agricultural ministers, as they said 2 days ago in Cordoba, they are basically doing a disservice to their own long-term goals. Because in the long term, what will happen is it will come into effect. Now, if you've got nothing to hide, then you don't need to push things through and change things here and there in pseudo-secrecy and change the entire raft of genetic modification legislation. If they're honest, then we can reach compromises. When we're looking at the issue, what form of risk assessment do we need for what sort of technologies and what would be necessary and appropriate? Those who think they need to steamroller this through, then I think they've got the wrong end of the stick. I'd like to thank you all very warmly for having been here. I do apologise that there was perhaps less debate than I would have liked to have seen, but we had some really exciting issues that we were addressing. We can't always explain things in 3 minutes, and I hope we'll meet again here very soon. And I think this constitutes the start of a very important new discussion on genetic technologies. And thank you very much to the interpreters.
Großen Dank auch an Benny Helin.
And thank you to Benny Helin as well for all the work.
Okay.
und dann unsere Büros, die das mit.
And all the experts who've helped us prepare this as well.
Ja, es gibt nicht nur Corinna.
Corinna, yes, but it wasn't just Corinna. There's Naomi, there's Akiko, Sebastian, a few others besides. So we appreciate your support. Thank you to the Green Group as a whole for the support you've provided for us, and we're certainly looking forward to perhaps having the next GMO-free conference with the socialists. Thank you very much. Safe trip home.